Okay, I don't know if I'm going to say this well. Probably not. For about, 40 years, I've been trying to figure out something that my pastors long taught, but it didn't make sense to me, about the grafting-in. Since the 1960s, or maybe even earlier, he's been teaching that the number of believers in church, which is the criterion for the rapture, the number of believers in church completes when it is the same as the number of demons who rebelled in the initial angelic conflict. Over the years since, he's been revising that, and I'm not quite sure what would have been his final stance on it when he stopped teaching in 2003. I have everything he's ever taught, so I'm still under him even though he's not teaching anymore. So I haven't gone through all of his, 15,000 or 50,000 maybe hours of teaching to chart out where he's been on this. I just know that's what he's said, and he bases it on a verse in the Bible which you'll see posted in the screen, which you can't tell in English, but in the Greek is talking about a one-on-one triumphal procession, which is analogized to the Appian Way triumph ending at the Mamertine dungeon. The idea being that there's one believer in church for every demon who puts the demon in jail for the 1,000 years. That's the entry into the topic of grafting in general. This particular instance of it is but one instance. God started the grafting in process at the beginning, kind of like I just talked about, where, perfection has a lot of parameters to it in order for it to be both free and perfect. Because you're going to be free forever in heaven, and you will freely never choose to sin. Well, for that to occur, being since you're a finite being, everything has to be just so to enable that to occur so that it's not forced. Okay, it was that way in the beginning when God created the angels. There was a perfect number of angels created. They weren't just perfect individually, but there had to be a perfect hierarchy among them. There had to be a perfect number. And this is the guiding concept which runs from Genesis to Revelation, is that basically mankind was going to be initially invented anyway in order for the angels to have something to rule. It was kind of analogous to Adam ruling the animals, so that you could come to see that you wouldn't feel bad about your own inferiority compared to God, because you had something inferior to you, and you could see your own love for the inferior, and therefore you'd understand better God's own love for you despite the fact that you're inferior. That was the plan all along. And you can see it cycle, okay, from Genesis to Revelation. And it's the same thing with this number business. 1/3 of the angels rebelled before Adam was actually created. So now the purpose of the creation of humankind switches to demonstrating in the trial why God was right to sentence the angels to the lake of fire, Matthew 25:41. But also to replace the perfect number of beings. Now, perfect angelic beings, in aggregate with all their attributes and thoughts and everything, that kind of quantity, as it were, isn't going to really be represented by the same number of human individuals necessarily. Alright, because you have this aggregate thought, really, that's the measurement. Okay, so the human race being grafted in now, not solely, based on whatever perfect number of humans there were going to be for the angels to rule. Now the reasoning is switched, because 1/3 of the angels rebelled, so now there's a replenishment, a grafting in, that has to take place of humans. And then as the story unfolds, you see a lot of other grafting ins that God does. Abel was the first son. He gets killed by Cain. So to graft in to replace both Cain and Abel, Cain was first, then Abel. So Cain gets grafted out, Abel gets grafted in, then Abel gets snuffed out, so Shem gets grafted in. Alright, and Shem means the name, and that's where Christ comes from, that initial son, or, the third one. So, third listed one. Anyway, you see a lot of grafting ins and grafting outs that go after that. Like, for example, the tribe of Levi. The sons of Jacob got all ticked off at the rape of Dinah in Shechem. They go and they kill all of the males using circumcision as a ruse to weaken the males so they could kill them. So what does God do? He switches out the entire tribe of Levi, grafts them back in two ways. First through Kohath, who was a progenitor of Moses. And Kohath gets it through the youngest of Levi's daughters. Alright? So that he's grafting in the tribe through a woman because the men were, cutting out the other males. It's God's sense of justice to match like that. Okay, so then you got fourth generation Moses, alright, being grafted in through the daughter of Levi. And that's why Kohath ends up becoming the head of the Levi family line. Very interesting in Exodus. So that grafting out and that grafting in, the same thing happens with Israel. Israel was basically, you had the firstborn of Egypt grafted out, Israel grafted in. Then Israel rejected God in 1050 BC, preferring a human king, Saul. And so God cuts all of Israel out, but grafts them back in through David's 2 Samuel 7 promise. And then, of course, the house of David ends up getting cut off with the Jeconiah curse. And you have the grafting in of Christ through Mary, who again is a daughter, probably of both the house of Levi and Judah. Of course, Aaron married a woman from the tribe of Judah, so those two tribes have always been intermingled. Anyway, so you have yet again a grafting in. So then the Jews reject Christ, so like Paul explains in Romans 9 through 11, we get grafted in, again, replacing. There is some number that rejects, so it gets grafted out. There is another number that will accept, so it gets grafted in. And the rapture occurs when the number has been completed. I wrote a whole webpage on that whole business about numbers, which is lvs4b.htm, which is in the video descriptions. You can click on the link. So what I'm trying to say here is this whole grafting in process, which, at this stage, the rapture is determined by these numbers. That's really precedented ever since the angelic conflict began and the angels rebelled. Now, is it or is it not correct to say that for every believer in church there, that's like representing one demon that rebelled? That was what my pastor taught off and on. Again, I'm not sure how he finally decided it, but it makes sense to argue. It brings up a lot of other intriguing questions, which I tried to explore in the first chapter of the novel I did, Pleroma de Rapture. So maybe the best thing to do is to read the first chapter of that novel and read LVS4B as in boy .htm if you're interested in exploring this idea further. But it is definitely a numbers criterion for the rapture. A number of persons who got paid for in advance on the cross have to complete, or it's a mistrial, because God has introduced evidence that has to come to exist. And if those persons don't come to exist, then God didn't keep his promise and Satan wins in the trial. I cover that also in the the LBS4B.htm page. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, this grafting in business as the condition for the Rapture, well then, you're going to be interested in looking at that web page and the novel.